All right. Well, it's lovely to see all of you here tonight. Good evening to you all. And it's my pleasure to be your host this evening and to welcome all of you to another Vets for Climate webinar. The health and well-being of country and people and animals are connected, and the world's oldest continuing cultures, Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, have held this truth for tens of thousands of years. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I would also like to acknowledge and sincerely thank Jethro Hardinge, who was our technical manager, and without whom this webinar would just not be possible. He's waving to you now. Jethro has provided us with some housekeeping to keep us right this evening, which I'll just run through. Please feel free to keep your webcam on, your camera switched on, because it's great for the speaker to feel that they're actually talking to people and not screens. If that's possible, if you can switch your cameras on. We will mute everyone during the presentation, but please keep your microphone on mute yourself. And please post any questions that you have for Mark in the chat window at any time, and we will ask them at the end of the session. If we miss your question, we will forward additional questions to Mark and will email everyone with the responses we receive. If you'd like to know more about Vets for Climate Action, this is just a little plug, please go to our website. Now, most of you tonight, or many of you tonight, I should say, many of you tonight already know me. My name is Janet Berry, and my veterinary career was spent supporting the livestock industry, cattle and sheep. First as a private vet in Scotland, and then as a government vet in Queensland. I now live on a beef farm in beautiful Tasmania, where my son has taught and demonstrated to me the benefits of regenerative farming in its broadest sense. For nearly 2 years, I have contributed to the work of Vets for Climate Action, a national charity with more than 1,500 supporters now, supporters from the veterinary profession, the animal care sector, and the broader animal care community. Vets for Climate Action supports policies to protect all animals by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, on behalf of Vets for Climate Action, it is my very great pleasure now to welcome our guest speaker this evening, Mark Davie. Mark is a central Queensland cattle producer and advocate for beef, the product and the production system. He is the chair of the steering committee for the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, a director of the AgForce Cattle Board, and a food manufacturer and marketer for Keppel brand and Cattleman's beef. Mark was also a member of the Land Use Change Goal drafting group for the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. That's a mouthful, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it. He is a leader within the Australian livestock industry that has set up an impressive carbon neutral target for 2030. Mark, may I hand over to you now, please, to give us your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I'll just get this shared up. There we go. Everyone can see it. Very good. I acknowledge you've done a welcome to country. I also like to start my presentations by talking a little bit about some of the Aboriginal Dreamtime concepts. So in the beginning, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were governed by laws that were laid down by creative ancestral beings, and law came from tradition and not from parliaments. The creative beings travelled across the countryside, giving the earth we see today, the rivers, the tributaries, the mountains, the grasslands. They then created the plants, animals and people that would inhabit that landscape, and also defined the boundaries on the country which would belong to each group, and laid down how land should be cared for by use and ceremony. And the basic principle was that people were obliged to maintain the land in its traditions for future generations. And this is sustainability. I always like to acknowledge that concept. So now I need to know, how do I move slides doing this? Hang on one moment. Oh, there we go. I'll tick through. So the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework is an initiative of the beef industry that was put together to really connect with the stakeholders of industry. So from our consumers to businesses that market and exist behind the supply chain, to organisations like NGOs that are critical. We want to talk to all of these stakeholder groups, understand what is important to them in the sustainability space, and how it is that industry can either change and track a continuous improvement along those items, or look at what it is we're not measuring and reporting to our customers, or that they currently don't understand about our supply chain. And we do this because it's critical for a number of reasons. We want to maintain market access, and we're seeing that more and more companies are worried about more than just the commercial and the finance. Sustainability and governance matter, and we want to maintain access to capital and financial markets for the industry. We want to minimise regulation by being proactive, by getting in front of it. And where we'll end the presentation is talking a lot about that carbon neutral 2030 goal. And I'm already seeing ways that industry's commitment and investment to that space means that we are in front of and driving policy, because we've already devised some of the solutions to those challenges. So we want to present industry-led solutions. And we also acknowledge that without the economics, ESG will fail. So there is a balance to be struck there. And we have to work on that and keep industry economically competitive, but ensure we want to be world leaders in sustainability. So these are our values, or in a way, I like to say they're the special sauce of the ABSF. So transparency, we are completely open in what it is we do and how we get to decisions. Inclusivity, we include everyone. Anyone can come and be involved from any part of industry, or any critics. So, we will have organisations that are openly critical of the beef industry are invited to our consultative committees. We want credibility. So the data we put forward has got to be credible. And we really rely on that. They've got to be grounded in evidence. We have to be practical, because obviously as we're finding, the more you try to measure your environment, there is a cost impact to that. So we've got to be practical about the indicators that we can apply. And we've got to be relevant. So we're constantly wanting to understand what's relevant to our stakeholders. Everyone's invited. And what we get is when people are all invited, you can call into them, but you can also call out to them when they're not acting in a way that aligns with these values. We have one opportunity to present industry in an open and transparent way, and we are very conscious of that. So over the last couple of years, we've had a number of projects on the go. This is one I thought would interest this group. So this is a materiality review that we had undertaken by an external provider. And what we did is when the framework started in 2015, we'd done one, and then we do it again. And what we're trying to identify is what is influential to our stakeholders and what is significant to industry that we can impact. So what are our most important issues down to important? The most interesting one there is number 15, which is biodiversity. In 2015, it didn't even come up. Following the 2019 bushfires, it was seen as equally the most influential decision with our stakeholders. So really the mentality of the people that talk to our organisation, the recognition of how critically important biodiversity is has suddenly become relevant. And what we then have to do is go and look at how are we going to get data to be able to demonstrate and measure our biodiversity. And there are a few exciting things coming along in that space around acoustics in the environment. So And what we have to do is then we have to find indicators, then we have to apply them to businesses that cover 50% of Australia's land mass, and also 50,000 agricultural enterprises. So that represents I guess, a big challenge. But, I think the old adage is true. If you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. So we need to really work out how to manage these critical indicators so that we can actually enhance how we can provide, a greater sustainable output, through biodiversity or through the environment and ecosystem services to the Australian community, and a greater benefit for what we invest in that space. So we report across a couple of key priorities every year, which each have indicators within them. So the new priorities out of this review, we had 18 new indicators, 15 removed because they were just a challenge to be able to measure. One we've kept in that we can't measure yet is still soil carbon sequestration. So we're excited about the work of the initiative of the last government to try and get the cost of carbon down, and the current government really taking that on as well, because it's going to be critically important. Where at the moment we've got ways to measure and account for all of our outputs. We're not properly accounting for the good side of the ledger yet, and we want to make sure we do that. The other critical new priorities were around community contributions and labour practices, along with biodiversity. And our biggest thing is we just need to fund sources of accurate data. I want to briefly touch on, we always acknowledge our integrity systems. They've never been more important than ever, and I'm sure it's a big topic of conversation among this group around the current risk of foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. And, industry is currently urging everybody to work as hard as they can to get their PICs up to date, to get their NLAS up to date, because that system will be critically important in how we can isolate and manage these large biosecurity risks that we currently have. Broader industry is now undertaking a big, both internationally and nationally, a goal-setting exercise. So this year was the first year, and we've got our report. I should have sent an electronic version, but I can send that through to be circulated to the group. Otherwise, you can access it on the ABSF website. For the first time, we've aligned our indicators to the UN SDG goals, which is very important. Government wants a lot of industries to do this. They're becoming increasingly critical to trade, particularly to the EU. So this is the first year we've gone out and aligned that to the 17 SDGs. We've also had within industry, there's a global roundtable of the sustainable beef, which brings together roundtables from a number of nations and also a number of large major stakeholders around the world. And we went through a goal development exercise. I was on the nature positive goal exercise. So these were the goals that came out of it for industry. Provide cattle with an environment in which they can thrive through best practices, was for animal health and welfare. Climate, reduce the net global warming impact of beef by 30%. So obviously the Australian industry has a lot more ambitious target than that, but the global industry wants to get everyone involved in the boat. You want to get the South Americans, you want to get people from the developed world as well. And so that becomes an interesting process, but we want to bring everyone in industry along. Nature positive, so ensure that the beef value chain is a net positive contributor to nature, is the nature positive goal. There are a number of goals that the Australian industry has committed to. Obviously, there's the 2030 goal, where we want to have no net release of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere by 2030. We'll talk a bit more about that at the end, but that is a truly radical and groundbreaking goal for an industry to take up in 2017. The other ones are animal welfare. So we want 100% use of pain relief by 2030. So these are where we're currently tracking across industry. That's the industry's aspirational goal. What we see is that the use of pain relief on farm is really a one-way door. And so once producers start to go through that, but industry is going to have to drive a lot of extension to get it up to that 100% by 2030. The feedlot industry has committed to have cattle with 100% access to shade by 2026. So they only came out with that last year. They're currently at 58.9%. And that's a credit to that industry for taking an ambitious goal straight away and saying, okay, we're going to apply this. We are currently trying to develop a goal around nature positive, which will look at the aspects of biodiversity, on-farm pest and weed management, forest restoration activity, and improve water quality. Goals need to come from industry and all the organisations within it, so we have to make sure that all the stakeholders are driving those. Some of our key highlights from this year's update. So soil health. This is an exciting indicator because it was the first time we had it available. So we have gone out and had ground cover mapped across Australia, across all the NRM regions. We have set thresholds for NRM regions based on location. So, and we measure it at the end of September, so at the end of dry season. So in last year it was about 50%, and this year it was at, this is in 2019, and last year, September, sorry. So the year before it was 50%, to September last year was 79.6% of NRM regions achieved healthy ground cover. Obviously we've had a drought break, but it hadn't broken in every region by then. So yeah, I'm particularly enthused by the progress on ground cover. If it was an inland region, that threshold is 50% ground cover. Coastal region is 70% and high rainfall region is 80% ground cover at the end of September. Forest, woodlands and grasslands. So we measure these with our own mapping across all of Australia. We put together a panel of experts in vegetation management, and we measure forest as 20% to canopy cover 2 metres high. Woodland is 10% canopy cover 2 metres high, and everything else is outside of those regions. And we have seen across that time period an increase in forest cover across the Australian industry, forestry and woodland. Climate change resilience is a factor that we've been able to get measured by the Productivity Commission. They make an adjustment for climate and apply that to and I'm not an economist, so this is probably the most difficult one to explain. They apply that to the total factor productivity. So effectively, I think for last year, our productivity was about 9%. When we adjust for climate change, it's 18%. So we are increasing our climate resilience as an industry, which will become critically important. And I think that's particularly a conversation that, as far as management and practice change, we need to be talking about climate change resilience when we've got rain, when we've got grass, not next time we're back into a drought. Food waste. So the Australian government has set a goal around eliminating food waste, and there was 2.39 million tonnes of food waste recovered along our supply chain in 2021 and diverted from landfill. And that is up to the supermarket. And obviously the challenge, a lot of the participants in our group and stakeholders are the major supermarkets, and they're very focused on packaging and food waste. We also like to highlight the nutritional value of beef, just because industry is currently having a comparison with products that like to use our livery and imagery. And just the fact that we as an industry created 32.3 billion meals last year, and we have a role in feeding the world and feeding the world nutritious protein. So I guess the key highlight and the interesting thing for probably this group, 2017, industry come up with this ambitious goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. A long way ahead of probably anyone else in the world at that stage. And I think it's almost like deciding to put a man on the moon in a way. If you don't set a goal, that's not where you're going to end up. So we set a goal. And the work we're seeing in these in these preliminary years around getting industry to that goal is really laying the groundwork. We're identifying those points where we're going to be able to achieve it, where we've got to put our funding in. And at the moment, it's hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And we're identifying where we think we're going to need more funding to get to those solutions and to get to some of those things like emissions avoidance activities to be commercially viable. So critical pathways. So the first one is leadership development. So nurturing, developing stakeholders within industry that are going to champion these goals, aligning all the strategies of industry, working with those peak groups that drive our organisation, and developing science and communications initiatives. So this is really about the people aspect of the goal, because we need to develop the people that are going to enable us to undertake the science. And to also, the biggest thing in industry and in any kind of, currently MLA's done a lot of past research, it's extension. It's getting it on farm, it's getting it from the lab or from the scientist and from MLA out into practice in farm is how we're going to get to this goal. GHG avoidance activities. So these are things like the livestock supplements, and I'll go through a couple of those in detail next. Whether that be in feedlot, because obviously we've identified with Asparagopsis that a very low intake of it drives a large amount of emissions reduction. In vegetation management, how we manage our carbon stock on farm, savanna burning and I guess cool burning initiatives, which are going to be critically important for Australia to get to our country's 2035 and 2050 goal. We've got to think about how we operate in our landscape. And in 2019, 2020, we had all of our national CO2 emissions released through bushfires to effectively double our accounting for that year. If we get to 2049 and we have another massive bushfire event, are we going to go out and buy carbon credits from somewhere else in the world to achieve that goal? How are we going to ensure that in our landscapes, and what we have is, cattle, I guess, is a way in that 50% of landscape of managing those fuel loads. I only saw some warnings come out today about the current fuel loads that exist in our landscape. We've kind of got the perfect storm of all this rainfall, all this flooding, all this fuel, and very high cattle prices, which means people aren't just going out and buying lots of cattle to help reduce fuel loads. And we've either got to remove some of that cellulose out of the environment through proactive cool burning in the current period, or we need cattle or ruminants to eat it. And so, savanna burning is, I guess, an initiative of trying to avoid those hot fires and trying to have fires in our environment that will enable our native wildlife to be able to escape. We had some bushfires before the 2019 in our part of the world, which kind of a wall moved 20, 30 kilometres within an hour, and in some parts glass has formed over the sand, and we just need to avoid those kind of fires within our landscape. The other big one is legumes. Use of landscape legumes, particularly in the north of Australia, present a big opportunity to help reduce methane emissions. Energy efficiency within our processing sector and our feedlots is a massive opportunity, and obviously they've got a lot of bioreactors. And I know with the current energy crisis, a lot of processors are probably wishing they invested in more and more of those projects, and it's actually bringing forward their energy projects because of the current cost of energy to source energy through the capture and generation of it in methane. And then obviously we've got genetics. And if we can increase the reproductive rates of cattle, particularly across the Northern Australia herd where we have some lower reproductive rates, we could increase our herd efficiency by up to 25%, turn cattle off younger, you reduce your carbon footprint over the life cycle. A couple of the big, I guess, Asparagopsis, which is the kind of one that everyone's heard about, and there's plenty of investments in that space in the feedlot area. Our big challenge is that we've got an extensive production system. not like Europe and not like in a feedlot where cattle are out in the natural environment, and it's very hard to give them a supplement every day. So there's a lot of investment going into 3-NOP early life programming trial, which is where cattle are provided with 3-NOP at weaning, and they believe there is a big reduction in total of life methane emissions through that treatment. Obviously, there's phenotypic selection, and there's already some private cattle operators that are trying to select cattle for cattle that produce lower methane. Things like genetic selection for weight or speed of turnoff, and then obviously legumes within the environment. And there's a number of targets we can achieve through those goals. Carbon storage. So how can we sequester carbon within our environment, whether that's through legumes, through trees, through management of our grassland. I'm not sure if you guys would have seen, there's a business that's currently having a project validated that had sequestered 50 kilos of carbon for every 1 kilo of beef. And that's in, I think, Iswold or Mundubra in Queensland. And if that's validated by the government, that'll be an enormous breakthrough for industry. And that's through practice change, regenerative techniques on farm. And I think that was announced at the RCS conference. The other big opportunity is trees, and there's a whole conversation about deforestation and regulation of trees, and there's an opportunity for Australia to make a lot of these, I guess, gains through how we put trees back in our landscape, but in a way that allows us to be productive around them. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. How am I going for time? Because I can really drag on, guys. Around these topics. Obviously, we've got dung beetles, which is very used in southern parts of the state and being more and more of Australia, being more and more introduced. And then legumes within farm, and then integrated management systems. So measuring and accounting for these things, looking at how we're implementing them, looking at the methodologies of how we account for things, which is really how this discussion kind of started with Stuart. Because we are trying to measure and hit a goal around a biological system, and we're applying completely man-made accounting practices to it. So the more we can get those, I guess, finessed to best suit the environment and also the outcomes that we want, and that we want as in society, not the beef industry, that society want, the better it will be for all of us. So deforestation. So there is an increasing push for zero deforestation in beef. The EU is driving to a no deforestation supply chain. We've had COP26. We're getting ready for COP27, and they're doing a commitment by 2030. McDonald's have some serious commitments around deforestation. There is a task force for nature-based financial disclosures, which is like the task force for climate-based disclosures. And these are groups that will define financial and reporting requirements for listed companies globally. We've got our own industry's goals in the UN SDGs. The challenge for industry is really around, and we've seen the State of Environment report come out recently. The challenge is around what is a forest. So in Australia, I've talked about the definitions we use around 2 metres and 10%, 20% and 10%, 2 metres. The EU definition will be 10% is a forest, but 5 metres high, which is probably a definition that would work better for Australian producers, particularly in regenerative parts of our landscape in the Brigalow and the Mulga, where 2 metres, previously cleared land can get back to 2 metres in a dense monoculture within only a couple of years. There are a lot of producers that would love to be able to get back to an open woodland, as a lot of these spaces would have been before settlement, with burning practices within it. And we kind of need to think about how we deal with this challenge in a mature way that will deliver society and the environment the greater goal on that front. Because it's, I guess, definition really is what our industry applies, and the ABSF is about definition and not a prescription for active management. Industry and its industry groups want land to be managed by the bioregion. We don't really feel that managing canopy change from a satellite is a really good way to manage canopy change from a satellite. It's probably not a good way to manage outcomes on the ground. So on our own property, we do a lot of work with bulldozers and lantana and rubber vine. Now from a satellite, they look great and they're a forest. We don't want to clear native trees. We want a high canopy that will protect our pastures. We've got a landscape that's got a lot of introduced species within it that we've got to manage. So does Australia have a deforestation issue? Obviously, a lot of the media says that we do. The properties highlighted in that ABC article would be out in the Brigalow Belt. For producers, there is a challenge where the greatest amount of clearing comes before the threat of regulation. And there are people that are still alive today that would have bought blocks out of a ballot in that part of the world. And the government regulation at the time was, if you don't clear all of the brigalow off it, we will take that block off of you. So within those people's lives, we've gone a full swing. And we really want to depoliticise this space because it's not good for industry and it's not good for the environment for it to be a political football. So how should we manage our land? So our Indigenous population practice active vegetation management, low intensity fires for up to 60,000 years. That effectively created a regenerating landscape. And there has been historical documentation of that process with high trees and low underwood. And there are producers with huge amounts of landscape in Queensland that have said we would be happy to get to 80% canopy cover in parts of our landscape if we could do it in a way that gets us back to a high canopy. The current problem is to get there, the current regulation, if you see brigalow or mulga, it grows as a monoculture and it's thick, and because we've intervened in that landscape. So how do we get it back there? Because if you've got 50, 60 metre high trees, the amount of carbon they're going to sequester is going to be enormous. We have to have a mature conversation about how to return our landscapes to that. This is the current national accounts. So currently we have forest levels that are back to 1990. When you look at, I guess, the current media and reporting, it doesn't reflect that, and different timelines are in it, but this is the national accounts of vegetation. Australia was the second highest average annual net gainer of forest behind China in the world, and even did more than Europe in the last 10-year period. And our other challenge is, how do we feed the world? And this kind of feeds into why I get excited about industry's carbon neutral goal, because we're trying to do it in a way that's productive to achieve these other challenges. Our biggest threat is the half-life of methane is very politically expedient for carbon neutral 2030 goals, and locking up land for vegetation to grow is probably a very cheap way for fossil fuel emitters to offset their own activities. We need carbon goals to be reached in supply chain. We need people to be not offsetting, but insetting. Oxfam kind of highlighted the challenge of, one of the European countries plan to offset their carbon growth by planting trees in Africa, potentially on agricultural lands. There's a risk that it could really become the next colonialism in a way, if that's how we address it. Society needs to get in with this critically important goal and look at how we do it, but how do we balance it with feeding the world and with our environment and achieving the greatest outcomes for the environment. And that's where I'm excited about us creating a nature positive goal, because the environment is a qualitative animal. We could develop quantitative numbers that come from tens of thousands of qualitative measurements projects across farm, demonstrating how we're achieving that goal. So I guess I really want to open the discussion up. I've covered a few concepts at the end, but love to have some questions with everyone and really want your input and feedback.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for that. That was really, really illuminating. I've put a couple questions in the chat, but I might as well just shoot them at you anyway. And I'll have to apologise. My understanding of the industry in general might not be superb, but my first question was just around feedlots versus classic pasture-based systems. Do you think there's an opportunity to sort of make a transition into feedlot systems to sort of preserve land use and make it more economical in that regard, so that maybe that could be used for like solar farms or reforestation, as you sort of mentioned, and sort of like marry the two?
I think that the big opportunity is if we keep cattle in that landscape, and if you look at some regenerative techniques, it's for a less and less time period. So some producers, cattle might be on a piece of country for 30 days a year. Managing the fuel load, and that's also what helps sequester more carbon, because grass wants to be eaten. That's what stimulates it to store more carbon. But the other thing it does, and there's a paper out of UQ that identifies this, is it helps protect that landscape. A lot of our wildlife loss in the bushfires was national park. And there are some animals like koalas that have actually, you know, they can coexist with cattle because they get the benefit of, if a farmer is in the landscape, you're going to remove those fuel loads, but you're also going to undertake weed and pest management around wild dogs. Wild cats are a huge problem. We've got a lot of lovely furry creatures that have a challenge with some of these other predators coming into the environment. I think feedlots are critically important for being able to feed the world, because they get out of that last 40, 60 days short feed, you're getting the most into the animal to be able to, you know, produce more kilos of beef. But the other thing feedlots are really good for is in an environment where we're using cattle, you know, in a way that the conversation moves down and down. You know, the cattle are there because you're trying to manage grass. The grass is there because you're trying to manage soil carbon and soil health. And therefore, in Australia, where we've got this drought issue, if we were to say not have feedlots and everyone go back to grass-fed bullocks, how much cattle you can pull into in and out of the environment is a challenge. And a lot of the producers that are doing rotational grazing, it's backgrounding they do. So I think they work together because the feedlot helps absorb that you know, load of cattle and animals out of the environment, give people a market avenue without having to wait to a set size to go to slaughter. But I just feel that cattle can be so important to be in that landscape because the government can't afford to manage 50% of Australia's landscape. They don't really currently, particularly at a state level, fund management or operations in national parks as much as what is needed now. And I've noted this year, I think they're really starting to step up in that aspect, which is great. But what we want to do is look at how do we increase flexibility in our environmental regulations to deliver the best outcomes for nature, by allowing industry to be productive in that environment, but get those co-benefits for animals. And there's the stewardship program that the last government was putting in that I think Murray Watt said he was behind as well, in forest program, which is about doing that because yeah, we need people in our landscape trying to manage challenges around fuel load, and introduce species and weeds and pests, because in my part of the world that's also a huge challenge, is lantana and rubber vine.
I can imagine up in Queensland you have plenty of pests to deal with.
Yeah, that's right. But I guess we want it to be a balanced conversation, and obviously there are parts of the landscape that, you know, can be put aside for nature. And we actually have a figure within our framework. I should look at the snapshot, and I should know these off by heart. But I think industry has set aside about 4% of the environment for nature reserve. So that's a massive I guess, a massive kind of amount of Australia's landscape, particularly, when you look at the size of the industry. And I'll find out as we continue this discussion.
Sounds good. And you sort of touched on my second question, which was just around, I guess, the incentive for producers to make the switch to more sustainable practices. I understand there is sort of that market demand. You mentioned McDonald's, which is providing that, but do you see there being any, I guess, legislative requirements for producers, and what sort of support is really out there for farmers to, adopt these practices, I suppose, because some of them aren't always in the best financial position to, sustain themselves, let alone start adopting, regenerative farming and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and if we can get those market incentive programs, so there are numbers, there's the opportunity of the income stream, so income streams around biodiversity, and also income streams around carbon, and particularly soil carbon, because I think what we'll see is when you get that soil carbon income stream, that drought management decision will then become a decision around offloading cattle to protect the soil carbon side of it. And I actually think we will eventually start to flatline. We've got a hugely cyclical, boom and bust kind of industry. And if there are incentives to make decisions earlier around stocking, we'll actually start to see industry hopefully bring that together and have a smoother operating environment. Big driver coming from the marketplace. McDonald's now, the conversation has moved globally to regen. There are a number of processes that California is really the leading market in this space. And every different customer, Whole Foods, what have you, has a different definition of what regenerative agriculture is. There was a processor down in Tasmania that went to their producers to set up a framework of how they could achieve, a certified regen brand to sell to their customers. And the word regenerative is really polarizing in industry. There's actually a guy doing a scientific study on perceptions of the word regenerative in farming, because some of these producers then said, oh, no, I don't want to be involved because it's called regenerative. And then they were like, okay, well, it's actually worth about 20, 30 cents a kilo. And they then changed their mind and were happy to be involved. So we've all got a different definition. We probably need to work out, what is going to be the defined definition. And industry needs to define that. Otherwise, we will have a different certification program for all these customers around the world. But I mean, incentives are critically important. There is regulation, particularly, I'm in a reef catchment, so we're seeing more and more regulation come through that way. I guess our other challenge with the deforestation conversation is Queensland producers are actually the most heavily regulated and monitored in the world. And we're accepting of that, but we're not game enough to wear the badge of it, and we're not getting that story told. So if there is a satellite sweeping our countryside every, X number of days, infringement notices will be issued. And land will have to be rectified and returned back to it if it's remnant vegetation. We also have this category X, which is the land we're allowed to manage, and that's what brings up the contention. So does that help?
It does. And I guess there are grants and sort of support mechanisms out there for farmers to make the switch if they need to, or if they want to, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. But the huge thing is extension and how you get through. There are a lot of people that will do what they've always done, and how you can, start to get through and portray the benefits and the opportunities. And having that 2030 goal means we're going to have to solve that problem pretty quick.
Yeah, I can imagine. Thank you for that. I've got more questions, but I'll let someone else take the floor for a bit.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
that was a great start, Regina. Thank you very much for starting the questioning. There are more questions, and I'd like to go to Matt. Matt's had his hand up to ask a question. Please, Matt.
Thanks, Mark, for the talk. Appreciate your time tonight and putting it together in the evening hours. My question's around two inputs to beef that aren't mentioned in your talk or covered really by MLA. The first is fertiliser. So yes, much of the herd is extensive beef, where fertiliser is not an input, but the other part is. So we have significant fertiliser use on our other lands, beyond our range lands, for about 35% or so of the beef production, or beef and dairy, depending on where you look at it. That fertiliser is currently manufactured using fossil fuels. Fertiliser is manufactured using gas. Now, this is a tremendous challenge. I don't sidestep the issue of trying to feed people here. This is not a critique of the beef industry being bad. My view is the beef industry is probably one of the greatest opportunities we have for improving our carbon emissions in the short term. But we need to be straight with people about fertiliser, and we need to be straight with people about pesticide. The fossil fuel industry is presently switching from their energy, so oil and gas extraction has been going to energy dominantly, but it's switching to petrochemicals because of the cost benefit equation for them in that market. Pesticide use is increasing in Australia dramatically, and it's increasing for fodder production, and it's increasing for grain production, both of which our cattle industries are reliant upon to a significant extent. Within pesticides they're almost all got backbones that are fossil fuels. That's the feedstock that produces these chemicals. Have we got a plan, and can we be straight with people to talk to them in the industry about how are we going to transition away from the use of these things? Because it seems to me that if we ignore these two inputs, and we're talking very big chunks of emissions here, we can't address the climate challenge if we continue to expand extraction of fossil fuels. And this year in Australia, we will extract more fossil fuels than in any year previously in our history.
No, definitely. And I imagine they would have to account for that in their footprint. We're getting a new life cycle done, but nitrogen within fodder would have to be accounted. So I can actually investigate that. Obviously, we're going through some of those high-level programs, but I guess the more we can reduce and make our current fertiliser use more efficient, and the cost of fertiliser will dictate that. I was only listening to a podcast today that talked about the challenge of how we achieve, the society achieves this goal, because we operate with four main materials, or concrete, steel, plastic, and ammonia. And what we've seen in Sri Lanka, I guess, is the risk of what happens if you try to do that too quickly. And the challenge will be...
That's not really very accurate though, Mark. I think you better be read a little more into the Sri Lanka story in terms of, the lack of fertiliser being the cause of the issue there. There's more than 10 years of history in Sri Lanka of corrupt governance, and exporting of millions of dollars, creation of debt from China, creating debt for that country that then they could not afford to put any inputs in, let alone afford to try and transition their food system. So it's
but I mean, the aspect of their fertiliser use and the impact on yields is partly to do with that issue of we are dependent to feed however many billion people there are in the world currently, and the challenge of how society, I don't know how many years are left of fertiliser in the world.
Not sure on the phosphorus front. We're running out. If we continue to extract fossil fuels endlessly, then perhaps we can keep making nitrogen fertiliser forever. But I don't think we'll be around. So, I mean, this is it is cataclysmic stuff, and I think that some of the areas where there are, I think, very promising signs are in the regenerative agriculture space, where there are very serious attempts to reduce pesticide inputs, and those things are real opportunities. So this is only a minority of the production at this point in time, but some of those properties certainly are achieving commercial levels of production. So they're not risking loss of productivity. That's not a direct relationship between how we choose to run these production systems. but there certainly are opportunities there to do an awful lot better than what we're doing with them. And I think that might go, Stuart, to your issue about your calculations with your cows, how it all goes wrong, is you've got to add your fertiliser and you've got to add your pesticide in to do real maths. If you leave those outside, you're faking it, and faking it ain't going to fix it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
And I guess the huge challenge is, if you can solve that problem of how society, and that goes into food beyond beef, can produce as much, food for its population as what it currently does, it's something else. You'll be a very wealthy man.
Well, I'm working pretty hard on it, Mark, and I think the beef industry and the dairy industry can do a lot more in that space as well. But what I'm suggesting is that if we do nothing, then we're doing a lot of advertising here. We're not doing anything about the problem, and that's a very short-term industry view, one that could see industry disappear due to climate consequences within our lifetimes, Mark.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you. Can we move to one or two questions that are coming in about the ways to reduce methane emissions from cattle? Helen, you're here with us. Helen is a former Chief Veterinary Officer. So as part of the group of former Chief Veterinary Officers who have been speaking to the livestock industry about a ruminant emissions reduction program. Helen, would you like to say something or ask a question?
Yes, thanks, Janet. I have been, am I on mute? No, I'm off. Okay, I have been putting comments in the chat rather voluminously, but mainly to Matt. But look, I do agree that the issues around things like fertiliser and pesticide use are critical. The main issue is that they are less used in the Australian beef industry than they are in most other human food production. There's tremendous use in grain production and in cotton and various other things, So if we say, well, cotton's bad, well, then we would be going for fossil fuels to wear synthetics, So there are no easy choices here. We've got to find low input ways of sustainably producing all our food and fibre needs, and this argument is part of that. I think the steps forward are going to rely on whole farm systems. They're going to rely on tried and true systems that were around before we invented pesticides and things like that. There was a system in England in the Doomsday Book that William the Conqueror wrote, which was the 3-field system, where there was one field of grass and one field of crops, and then a fallow. And so there was a rotation, and we have to come back to those things, but they're not necessarily suited for all parts of Australia. So many different beef systems operate. Most of our, the largest land area is carried on in very extensive systems where the main issue is not to overgraze, to get young cattle off quickly, and to maintain only the right number of animals to be able to reproduce the next year without flogging out the country and causing it to become a desert. And the beef industry has made tremendous steps in that. The other thing is the genetics, because methane emission is inversely correlated with food absorption, with efficiency of food conversion. And so improving genetics is terribly important in the beef industry, and that is being tackled. It's slow, but it's very steady, and it's baked into the genetics of the cattle that are being bred these days. So I think there is room for hope. There's a terrible urgency about doing these things as quickly as possible. I don't think we're going to produce more cattle in Australia. It always goes between about 24 and 27 million cattle, depending on seasonal conditions. It's a question of, can we turn off maybe more beef from the same cattle and do it more efficiently and let the manure go back in? Can we convert it to biochar so it becomes permanently fostered there, and we save half the carbon that the cattle have eaten back in as permanent carbon into the landscape? These are all big questions, and a lot of behavioural change is needed. Just my comment.
Thank you, Helen. Mark, would you like to comment that? We're nearly running out of time, but would you like to comment on what Helen has said?
We need some Brahmins that have reproductive rates like Angus. Is that what
Could be right, and feed conversion efficiency as well.
Yeah.
That's the challenge. Yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, there's so much opportunity in reproduction, and then also there's huge opportunity in going back to the food supply chain, food waste.
Absolutely.
We as a society, we've got countries like Ireland that are going to cut their methane emissions by 30%, and we've got 30% food waste. We could just waste less food and achieve a 30% cut. But,
or if you turn all the waste into biochar, use half of the carbon in that waste to fuel the operation, and the rest goes into carbon that can be put back in the soil, or it can even be fed to cattle as a feed additive, and then the dung beetles take it down deep into the soil where it sits for the next 100 or 1,000 years. There are a lot of options, but we've got to be very innovative. We've got to be terribly fast about a lot of these solutions.
Yep, yeah. And we've just got to, the issue around some of the energy industry is, what I see more and more is they want to separate our emissions from our sequestration, because that kind of suits their, their policies that they want to pursue. And, really we've got this biogenic carbon cycle and photosynthesis, and we've got these things work together. And I think the answers to climate change exist in biological systems. We just need
Absolutely.
to work harder.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I'm afraid we've reached 8 o'clock, which is the end of this webinar. Thank you very, very much for coming along and talking to us, Mark. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I'm certainly going to watch your presentation again, because I've been focused on other things this evening, trying to work things out. But I'm going to watch your speech again, and thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody who's come along this evening and for all your questions. And we look forward to another webinar in the future. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you. And sorry, I wasn't active on the chat. I'm not that skilled to talk inside. But thank you all. I think it's been a really great discussion, and I could just keep talking, but we've all got to go. And Matt, if you solve that fertilizer problem, give me a call. I'll invest.
Just come along to Sydney Uni. You'll actually be able to see what's already in progress, Mark. So about more than a decade ago, I started working with a group up here, integrating an aquaponic system. So this idea of capturing food waste, I attempted to get the Australian government to lead on the production of insect meal. Unfortunately, they didn't fund me. Regrettable, given we've now got a $100 million industry operating out of South Africa doing black soldier flies. Nonetheless, we still went on with it, and we've now got an $8 million glass house sitting at Sydney Uni, producing organic fruit and vegetables that you're buying in your supermarket now. And we're doing it with very, very low energy cost, incredibly low energy cost, significantly less water, and zero effluent. There are no effluent leaving the facility whatsoever. So none of the pollution. So I'm happy to walk the talk, mate. And what I'm asking is for the beef industry to be transparent and come clean with people and say, look, this is an Achilles heel. We need to come together, not be driven apart, to try and solve this.
But I'd have to look at their methodology, but I would have thought they'd have to cover, nitrogen use in crops that are used in food.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That'd be.
Thank you, Matt.
Take a look at that. All right.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to end by saying that so much has changed. Can you imagine where we were 2 years ago? And so much has changed in the last 2 years. Maybe we should ask you back in a year's time, Mark, and we'll see where things have got to then.
But bring me back in 2029 and hold me to account.
Let us all say thank you very much to Mark. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.